Out. You don't belong here. The words echoed across the pristine courtyard of Riverside Manor like a slap across sacred ground. Samuel Hayes stood at the ornate iron gates, his muddy work boots leaving prints on marble steps that had been polished to perfection. The security guards blocked his path with the kind of authority that suggested they'd thrown out plenty of unwelcome visitors before. His hands were rough from decades of tilling soil, his clothes carried the honest dirt of farm work, and his weathered face told the story of a man who had spent his life under the sun. To everyone watching from the mansion's windows, he looked like exactly what they expected from a simple farmer who had somehow wandered onto their exclusive estate. Behind him, luxury cars filled the circular driveway as guests arrived for the charity gala that would raise millions for agricultural preservation. Men in $1,000 suits and women dripping with jewelry stepped around him like he was an obstacle to be avoided, their expressions suggesting they couldn't understand how someone so obviously out of place had managed to get past the outer security. But what none of them knew, what the guards couldn't have imagined, was that the man they were throwing out carried in his jacket pocket a dusty envelope containing documents that would change everything. Papers that proved the farmer they mocked didn't just belong at Riverside Manor. He owned every inch of ground they were standing on. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Riverside Manor had been the crown jewel of Californian wine country for over a century. The estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of some of the most valuable agricultural land in the Napa Valley, its rolling hills covered with pristine vineyards that produced wines sold for hundreds of dollars per bottle. The main house, a stunning example of Spanish colonial architecture, had been featured in magazines and movies as the perfect symbol of American agricultural aristocracy. For the past 20 years, the estate had been managed by the Pemberton Foundation, a prestigious charitable organization that used the property to host fundraising events for various agricultural causes. The foundation's board consisted of some of the wealthiest and most influential people in California, individuals who saw Riverside Manor as their private playground for networking and social climbing. Tonight's event was particularly important. The Agricultural Preservation Gala was expected to raise over $5 million for programs supporting small farmers and sustainable agriculture. The irony was lost on most of the attendees, who arrived in vehicles worth more than most family farms and wore jewelry that could fund entire agricultural education programs. Samuel Hayes had been watching the preparations for tonight's gala from his small farmhouse 3 miles down the valley road. For months, trucks had been delivering flowers, furniture, and catering supplies to the estate. Workers had manicured every inch of the grounds until they looked like something from a fairy tale rather than a working agricultural property. Samuel had farmed the valley for 43 years, ever since he'd inherited a small plot of land from his grandfather. His 100-acre farm was modest compared to the sprawling estates around him, but he'd built a successful operation growing organic vegetables and raising heritage breed livestock. He was respected by other local farmers for his knowledge of sustainable farming practices and his willingness to help neighbors during difficult seasons. What made Samuel different from other farmers in the valley wasn't just his expertise or his reputation for integrity. It was the secret he'd been carrying for the past 6 months, ever since his grandfather's death had led to the discovery of documents that changed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. Samuel's grandfather, Thomas Hayes, had been a quiet man who rarely talked about the past. Samuel had known that Thomas had worked at Riverside Manor during the 1940s and 50s, but he'd always assumed his grandfather had been employed as a farmhand or groundskeeper. Thomas had lived modestly, saved carefully, and passed away, leaving Samuel the small farm and what appeared to be a lifetime of memories about simpler times. But while cleaning out his grandfather's papers after the funeral, Samuel had discovered a metal box hidden behind a false wall in the farmhouse basement. Inside were documents that told a story Samuel had never heard, a story that completely changed his understanding of his family's connection to Riverside Manor. The documents revealed that Thomas Hayes hadn't been an employee at Riverside Manor. He had been the owner. In 1952, facing financial difficulties during a severe drought, Thomas had entered into what he thought was a temporary management agreement with the Pemberton Foundation. The foundation would manage the estate's operations while Thomas retained ownership, with the understanding that he could resume direct control whenever he chose. But the agreement had been deliberately complicated, filled with legal language that Thomas, a farmer with only an 8th grade education, hadn't fully understood. The Pemberton Foundation had gradually taken more control over the property, making improvements and investments that gave them the appearance of ownership without actually transferring the title. For decades, Thomas had believed he'd lost his family's estate through his own poor business decisions. He'd accepted a modest pension from the foundation and had never challenged their control of the property. He'd been too proud to admit that he'd been manipulated and too intimidated by lawyers and legal procedures to fight back. The documents Samuel discovered proved that his grandfather had never actually signed away ownership of Riverside Manor. The management agreement had specific terms and expiration dates that the Pemberton Foundation had simply ignored. According to the legal papers Samuel found, Thomas Hayes and his heirs retained full ownership of the estate, including all improvements made during the foundation's management period. Samuel had spent months having the documents authenticated by legal experts and historians. Every analysis confirmed what the papers clearly stated. The Hayes family owned Riverside Manor and had never legally transferred that ownership to anyone else. The Pemberton Foundation had been operating on the property for 70 years without actually owning it. Now Samuel stood at the gates of his family's estate, watching wealthy donors arrive for a gala that would raise millions of dollars using property that belonged to him. He hadn't come to cause trouble or create a scene. He had simply come to inform the foundation's leadership about the ownership situation and begin discussions about how to resolve it fairly. The security guards, however, had taken one look at his appearance and decided he was some kind of protester or troublemaker who needed to be removed immediately. "Sir, you need to leave the premises right now," the head of security announced with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to immediate compliance. "This is a private event, and you're not on the guest list." Samuel looked past the guards toward the mansion where he could see elegantly dressed people socializing on terraces that his great-grandfather had built with his own hands. Lights twinkled in gardens that his family had planted and tended for generations. The irony of being blocked from entering his own property wasn't lost on him. "I understand this is a private event," Samuel replied calmly. "I'm not here to disrupt anything. I just need to speak with someone from the Pemberton Foundation leadership about a legal matter concerning the property." The guard's expression suggested that he'd heard similar claims from protesters and activists before. "Look, buddy, I don't know what your issue is with the foundation, but tonight's not the time to discuss it. You can contact their offices during business hours if you have some kind of complaint." Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the envelope containing the ownership documents. His grandfather had kept these papers wrapped in oilcloth and stored in the metal box for over 70 years. They were yellowed with age but perfectly legible, bearing official seals and signatures that proved their authenticity. "I think they'll want to see these tonight," Samuel said, offering the envelope to the guard. "These are legal documents that concern the ownership of this property." The guard glanced at the envelope but didn't take it. He dealt with plenty of people who claimed to have legal grievances against wealthy organizations. In his experience, most of them were either mentally unstable or running some kind of scam. "Sir, I'm not taking any papers from you, and I'm not passing along messages to the foundation board. If you have a legitimate legal issue, contact their attorneys during normal business hours. Right now, I need you to leave the property immediately." Behind the guards, more guests were arriving for the gala. Samuel watched as expensive cars deposited their passengers at the front entrance, where uniformed staff waited to escort them into the mansion. The scene was elegant and sophisticated, exactly the kind of event his grandfather would have felt uncomfortable attending even when he owned the property. Samuel understood the guard's skepticism. He looked like a working farmer because that's exactly what he was. His clothes were clean but practical. His truck was reliable but 20 years old. Nothing about his appearance suggested that he belonged among the wealthy donors who were gathering for tonight's event. But Samuel also understood something the guards didn't. He knew that ownership wasn't determined by appearance or social status. He knew that legal documents mattered more than assumptions. And he knew that his grandfather's story deserved to be told, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make the current occupants of the estate. One of the gala organizers, a woman in an expensive evening gown, noticed the commotion at the security checkpoint and approached to investigate. Rebecca Pemberton was the granddaughter of the foundation's founder and currently served as its executive director. She had grown up considering Riverside Manor her family's legacy and had never questioned their right to control the property. "Is there a problem here?" she asked the head of security, her tone suggesting that problems should be resolved quickly and quietly so they didn't interfere with the evening's festivities. "Just some local farmer who claims he has legal papers about the property," the guard explained. I've asked him to leave, but he's being persistent. Rebecca looked at Samuel with the kind of polite but dismissive expression that wealthy people often used when dealing with individuals they considered beneath their social station. She saw his work clothes and weathered appearance and immediately categorized him as either a disgruntled neighbor or someone looking for attention. Sir, I'm Rebecca Pemberton, the executive director of the foundation. I understand you believe you have some kind of legal concern about our property. I'd be happy to have someone from our legal department contact you next week to discuss whatever issues you might have. Samuel appreciated her politeness, but he could hear the condescension underlying her words. She was treating him like someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who deserved to be heard. He decided it was time to be more direct. Miss Pemberton, I don't think this can wait until next week. These documents indicate that my family owns Riverside Manor and that your foundation has been operating here without legal authority for the past 70 years. Rebecca's expression shifted from polite dismissal to something closer to annoyance. She'd dealt with property disputes before, usually from neighbors who disagreed with the foundation's land management practices or activists who opposed their development plans. In her experience, these kinds of claims were almost always baseless. Sir, the Pemberton Foundation has owned and operated Riverside Manor since 1952. We have extensive legal documentation of our ownership, and we've made substantial investments in the property over the decades. I'm not sure what papers you think you have, but I can assure you that our ownership is beyond question. Samuel nodded understanding. He didn't blame her for defending what she believed to be her family's property. If he'd been in her position, he probably would have reacted the same way. But he also knew that the documents in his envelope would change her perspective dramatically. Miss Pemberton, my grandfather was Thomas Hayes. He worked with your grandfather to establish the management agreement that brought your foundation to this property. But according to these documents, that agreement was temporary and ownership was never actually transferred. Rebecca's expression changed again, this time to something that looked like recognition mixed with concern. She'd heard the name Thomas Hayes before, but only in the context of family stories about the early days of the foundation's involvement with Riverside Manor. Her grandfather had occasionally mentioned an old farmer who had been cooperative during the transition period. What exactly are you claiming? She asked, her tone becoming more serious as she began to understand that this might not be a simple case of mistaken property boundaries or neighbor disputes. Samuel carefully opened the envelope and withdrew the ownership documents. The papers were fragile with age, but the legal language was clear and the official seals were unmistakable. He handed them to Rebecca, watching as her expression changed from skepticism to confusion to something approaching alarm. The documents told the story Samuel had discovered in his grandfather's basement. Thomas Hayes had indeed owned Riverside Manor in 1952. Facing financial difficulties during a severe drought, he had entered into a management agreement with the Pemberton Foundation. The agreement specified that the foundation would manage the estate's operations for a period of 25 years, after which control would revert to the Hayes family unless specifically renewed. The agreement had never been renewed. The 25-year term had expired in 1977, but the foundation had continued operating as if they owned the property. Thomas Hayes, intimidated by legal procedures and convinced that he'd somehow lost his rights, had never challenged their continued presence. Rebecca read through the documents twice, her face growing pale as she began to understand the implications. If these papers were authentic, and if the legal analysis was correct, then everything her family had believed about their ownership of Riverside Manor was wrong. These documents, she began, then stopped as she realized that dozens of wealthy donors were arriving for the gala that was supposed to begin in less than an hour. If there was any validity to Samuel's claims, tonight's fundraising event was taking place on property that the foundation didn't actually own. Miss Pemberton, Samuel said gently, understanding the shock she was experiencing. I'm not here to disrupt your event or cause problems for your foundation. I just think we need to have an honest conversation about the situation and figure out how to resolve it fairly. Rebecca looked around at the arriving guests, then back at the documents in her hands. As the foundation's executive director, she had legal and fiduciary responsibilities that required her to take any legitimate ownership claims seriously. But as someone who had grown up considering Riverside Manor her family's legacy, she was struggling to process what she was reading. The head of security, who had been listening to the conversation with growing confusion, stepped forward with a question that seemed to capture everyone's thoughts. Ma'am, what do you want me to do? Should I still remove him from the property? Rebecca looked at Samuel, then at the documents, then at the mansion where her guests were gathering for the most important fundraising event of the year. She was facing a decision that could change everything about her family's relationship with the property they considered their own for 7 decades. "No," she said finally. "Mr. Hayes, would you be willing to come inside so we can discuss this privately? I think we need to have a much longer conversation about these documents and what they mean." Samuel nodded, relieved that she was willing to listen rather than simply dismissing his claims. He'd been prepared for skepticism and even hostility, but Rebecca's willingness to consider the evidence was more than he'd dared to hope for. As they walked toward the mansion, passing groups of elegantly dressed owners who stared at Samuel's work clothes with obvious confusion, Rebecca found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about her family's history with Riverside Manor. The documents Samuel carried were clearly authentic. The legal language was consistent with agreements from the 1950s, and the signatures appeared genuine. If the papers were legitimate, then the Pemberton Foundation had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding for over 70 years. Inside the mansion, Rebecca led Samuel to a private office away from the gala preparations. The room was elegantly appointed with antiques and artwork that had been part of the estate for decades. Samuel recognized some of the furniture from stories his grandfather had told about the house during his childhood. "Mr. Hayes," Rebecca began, her voice carrying a mixture of professionalism and personal concern. "If these documents are authentic, then we have a very serious situation that goes far beyond property ownership. The foundation has invested millions of dollars in improvements to this estate over the decades. We've used it as collateral for loans and as the basis for our charitable operations." Samuel understood the complexity of the situation. He wasn't interested in destroying the foundation or causing financial harm to an organization that had genuinely tried to do good work. But he also believed that his grandfather's story deserved to be acknowledged and that the legal ownership of the property needed to be clarified. "Miss Pemberton, I'm not trying to cause problems for your foundation. But my grandfather spent the last 70 years of his life believing that he'd lost his family's property through his own mistakes. He never knew that the management agreement he signed had specific terms that weren't being honored." Rebecca nodded, beginning to understand that this wasn't just about property ownership but about justice for an old farmer who had been taken advantage of by people who should have protected his interests. "What do you want from us, Mr. Hayes? What would constitute a fair resolution to this situation?" Samuel had spent months thinking about that question. He consulted with attorneys and mediators about possible approaches to resolving complex property disputes. He'd also thought about what his grandfather would have wanted and what would honor the family's connection to the land. "I think we need to have the documents independently verified by legal historians and property experts," Samuel replied. "If they confirm what these papers appear to show, then we need to figure out an arrangement that acknowledges my family's ownership while recognizing the substantial investments your foundation has made." He paused, looking around the elegant office that had once been his great-grandfather's study. "I'm not interested in throwing your foundation off the property or destroying the work you've been doing. But I do think the true ownership situation needs to be acknowledged, and I think my grandfather's story needs to be told." Outside the office, the gala was beginning. Guests were enjoying cocktails and hors d'oeuvres while admiring the estate's stunning views and elegant gardens. None of them knew that the property's ownership was being discussed in a private meeting that could change everything about the foundation's operations. Rebecca found herself facing the most challenging decision of her professional career. The documents Samuel presented appeared legitimate, and if they were authentic, the foundation's entire relationship with Riverside Manor was based on a misunderstanding that had lasted for 7 decades. But she also knew that acknowledging the ownership dispute could jeopardize tonight's fundraising event and potentially undermine the foundation's ability to continue its charitable work. The organization depended on the prestige and stability of Riverside Manor to attract donors and maintain its reputation. "Mr. Hayes," she said finally, "I need to consult with our board of directors and legal counsel before we can make any decisions about how to proceed. But I want you to know that I take these documents seriously, and I'm committed to finding a fair resolution to this situation." Samuel appreciated her willingness to consider his claims, but he also understood that powerful organizations often promise to investigate issues as a way of delaying action while they develop strategies for protecting their interests. "Miss Pemberton, I respect your need to consult with your board and attorneys. But I hope you'll understand that this situation has been unresolved for 70 years, and my family deserves to have it addressed promptly and honestly." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the justice in his request. She looked at the documents again, noting the official seals and signatures that supported Samuel's claims about his family's ownership of the estate. What if we made an announcement tonight? She asked suddenly. What if we told our donors about the ownership situation and explained that we're working to resolve it fairly? It might actually enhance our credibility to demonstrate that we're committed to honesty and justice even when it's complicated. Samuel was surprised by her suggestion. He'd expected her to want to keep the ownership dispute quiet until it could be resolved through private negotiations. Her willingness to address it publicly suggested a level of integrity that he hadn't anticipated. That would be a remarkable gesture, he replied. But are you sure you want to complicate tonight's fundraising event with this kind of announcement? Rebecca smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Mr. Hayes, if we're raising money for agricultural preservation and support for small farmers, doesn't it make sense to start by acknowledging that this estate actually belongs to a farming family? Your grandfather's story is exactly the kind of thing our donors should hear about. She stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the gala gathering. Hundreds of wealthy donors were enjoying an elegant evening on grounds that might actually belong to the farmer they'd initially refused to admit to the property. Would you be willing to join me on stage tonight? She asked. Would you be willing to tell your grandfather's story to our donors and help them understand the real history of this estate? Samuel felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement at the prospect of addressing such a prestigious gathering. He'd never spoken to an audience of wealthy philanthropists, and he wasn't sure how they would respond to learning that their elegant venue had a more complicated history than they'd realized. But he also knew that his grandfather would have wanted the truth to be told, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make powerful people. Thomas Hayes had spent 70 years believing he'd failed his family by losing their property. It was time for people to know that he'd actually been the victim of a complex legal arrangement that had been manipulated by others. Yes, Samuel said finally. I'll tell them about my grandfather and about the documents we discovered. I think they deserve to know the real story about this property and about the farmer who originally owned it. Rebecca felt a sense of relief and excitement that surprised her. Instead of trying to hide or minimize the ownership dispute, she was choosing to embrace it as an opportunity to demonstrate the foundation's commitment to honesty and justice. The gala would continue as planned, but it would now include an unexpected element that would make it far more meaningful than a simple fundraising event. The story of Thomas Hayes and Riverside Manor would be told to an audience that could appreciate its significance and support efforts to resolve it fairly. As Rebecca and Samuel prepared to address the gala attendees, neither of them could have predicted how dramatically their brief conversation would change both of their lives. Samuel would soon discover that acknowledging his family's ownership of Riverside Manor would open doors to opportunities he'd never imagined. Rebecca would learn that facing difficult truths could actually strengthen an organization's mission rather than undermining it. The farmer in muddy boots who had been refused entry to the estate would soon be standing on stage in front of California's agricultural elite, telling the story of his grandfather's connection to the land beneath their feet. The documents he carried would prove to be authentic, leading to a partnership between the Hayes family and the Pemberton Foundation that would become a model for ethical land management and historical justice. But most importantly, Thomas Hayes would finally receive the recognition he deserved for his contribution to one of California's most beautiful agricultural estates. His story would be told, his legacy would be honored, and his grandson would ensure that the family's connection to the land would continue for generations to come. Sometimes the people we dismiss based on their appearance are exactly the ones who have the most important stories to tell. Sometimes the documents that seem too good to be true actually reveal truths that have been hidden for decades. And sometimes the most elegant estates have histories that are far more complex and meaningful than anyone realized. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.